Now I'd like to bring up Dr. Jeff Bremer. He's an associate professor of history here at Iowa State University. He's working on a book of the history of Iowa, and he's going to come up. We wanted to start with a talk that thought about social, cultural, historical context of the time period that this exhibition explores. So Jeff Bremer will give us a nice place to start thinking about some of these ideas and building on the history. So help me in welcoming Dr. Bremer. And you have your own microphone.
I think I'm all
Oh, look at you're all
up.
set up.
Okay. Normally I don't need a microphone as the voice carries fairly well. But they're supposed to record what I'm saying, so I guess I need to choose my words carefully and not be too snarky or sarcastic and avoid my normal behavior. I'd like to thank Vila and the symposium organizers for inviting me and putting this together. I am embarrassed to admit I had never been to this building or to this museum until they invited me, so thank you for forcing me out of my office and away from the classroom and over to someplace new where I get to see things that are different and are quite fantastic. So Leah, thank you for your wonderful talk last night. And so some of what I'm going to say here tonight will be repetitive. And that's because she did such a good job last night. So please forgive me for that. Third of all of you who support the university or the museums support, of course, work like this. Anyone who pays taxes in the state, anyone who has donated to this university, anyone who has sent kids to go to school here, you have supported the university, you've supported this museum, you've supported the work of myself and all the faculty and staff here at ISU. So thank you again. To start, if you think about what it is to be an American, and you don't think of a city, you probably think of a place like Iowa. The state of Iowa may not be at the center of the American story like New York or California, but it's central to who we think we are. It's often seen as an example of heartland values, full of hardworking farmers and small-town families. It's so representative of this country that China has replicated an Iowa farm outside of Beijing on several hundred acres. The state is more than a stereotype. It's more than just bland flyover country. It's a story, history and culture is more complex, diverse, and important than most realize. On June 1st, 1833, Iowa officially opened to American settlement. People rushed into the eastern portion of the territory, lured by the promise of fertile new land. The federal government ruled territories until they became states, surveying and selling land. Iowa quickly filled up with migrants. Though it was nominally a free state, slavery was tolerated but not widespread. A series of treaties forced the Sac-and-Meskwaki out of Iowa and opened up most of the territory to settlement by the mid-1840s. In December 1846, Iowa joined the United States. Thousands who had waited impatiently for Iowa to open up for settlement on June 1st. Those who tried to claim land early were chased out by the American military, whose officers included the future Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. Newcomers could settle on a strip of land about 50 miles wide, adjacent to the Mississippi River. The Sac, Fox, and other tribes had not yet ceded the rest of the territory in the mid-1830s. 3 ferries took people and animals across the Mississippi River to towns such as Dubuque and Burlington. Long lines of wagons waited their turn. Others crossed in boats, their horses swimming nearby. Some left before dawn, eager to explore and claim land. The first land sales in Iowa occurred in Burlington in October 1838. Thousands filled the town. Those with more wealth stayed in hotels, while most settlers stayed in more humble housing, often camping out. At a public land auction, each quarter section, or 1/4 of a square mile, of a township would be called out. The announcer or crier would then wait 30 seconds for a bid. George Duffield, who was a boy in the 1830s, wrote of his father's trip to Burlington to buy their claim. When he returned home, the family enjoyed, quote, the joy of possession supported by title. He said, our claim and cabin were indeed our own. He neglected to mention those who had lived in Iowa long before his family and other Euro-Americans showed up. While the government was selling land in eastern Iowa in the late 1830s, it had not yet forced the remaining Sac and Meskwaki tribal members from the territory. After the Black Hawk War and first forced land sales in the early 1830s, surviving tribal members had moved into central Iowa and away from the initial wave of settlers. They pursued a traditional cycle of hunting and agriculture, surviving in an area outside their normal hunting grounds. Their subsistence was hampered by a lack of large mammals to hunt. Bison had retreated to the Great Plains, and competition with settlers reduced the deer population. Scarce game forced them to hunt farther away, bringing them into conflict with the Sioux. Americans and Europeans continued to press into Indian lands as well. In 1836 and 1837, the two tribes were forced to sell more than 1 million acres of land in eastern Iowa. The ceaseless march of settlers west continually pressured the remaining tribal members. Iowa Territory had a white population of more than 46,000 in 1840. Thousands more came every year. Squatters took Indian land, while unscrupulous traders left them deep in debt. Disease and liquor also took their toll. All of this undermined the tribes and encouraged additional land cessions to Americans. In 1842, the U.S. government completed negotiations to finally remove the Sac and Meskwaki from the territory of Iowa. Initially, the government wanted the two tribes to move into southwest Minnesota, but they protested. Wapello, chief of the Meskwaki, told the Americans they had already been forced to sell Rock Island, Dubuque, and other places. He said, "This is all the country we have left, and we are so few now, we cannot conquer other countries. You now see me and all my nation. Have pity on us. We are but few and fast melting away." The Sac and Meskwaki had few options, though. They were deep in debt to white traders, and their annual annuity could not feed them. When hunting became increasingly difficult and whites threatened to take their remaining land, they sold it and went west. Almost 10 million acres of land were lost in an October 11th, 1842 territory. It mandated that all tribal members had to leave Iowa within 3 years. They were forced to migrate even farther west to Kansas. Most immigrants who came to Iowa in the mid-19th century were from northern states, places like Illinois, Ohio, or New York. But some were from Europe, with immigrants from Sweden and Holland among those that migrated to Iowa before the Civil War. People first settled in southeast Iowa and then moved northwest following river valleys. Immigrants went west seeking economic independence. A Wapello County history noted that older states like New York and Pennsylvania, were good to immigrate from. Those places were good to leave. Migrants wanted affordable farmland so they could feed themselves and following generations. Family welfare required property ownership, and cheap land provided the opportunity to start a new life or add to a family's wealth. James Crawford wrote to his father in Vermont, extolling the virtues of Iowa. He wrote, "I can raise all the provisions we shall want for 1/2 the labor you can on the best land you have in Vermont." But the ideal of the self-sufficient pioneer was mostly mythical. It was inconsistent with the Iowa experience, said historian Dorothy Schrader. Most Iowa farmers wanted to produce a surplus, make a profit, pay off debts. They wanted to buy land and improve their lives. The state's population grew tremendously after statehood, reaching more than 674,000 people by 1860. Almost 500,000 people came to Iowa in the 1850s alone. One of the great antebellum land rushes was here into Iowa in the 1850s. By 1860, settlement was pushed west to a rough line drawn from Mason City to Fort Dodge to Atlantic. One group that had been driven out of Iowa returned. Nearly a decade after their removal, the Meskwaki asked to purchase land in Iowa. Those who had been forced out of the state hated the dry, treeless Indian territory in Kansas, where they'd been sent. The legislature approved their return and land purchase. The Meskwaki initially bought an 80-acre settlement near Tama in east central Iowa. This was an unusual arrangement, as you probably know. They were the first tribe to buy land following removal. They avoided assignment to a federal reservation by working with the state of Iowa. Iowa held their land in trust, with the condition that they pay taxes and followed state laws. The tribe survived through hunting and farming, as well as trade with non-Indians and other tribes. When they received federal allotment money, they purchased more land. About 250 tribal members lived in Iowa, remaining self-sufficient and self-governing through an area infamous for the repression of Native peoples, wrote historian Eric Zimmer. Ownership of land helped the Meskwaki avoid the fate of other tribes, who lost 80 million acres of land to the federal government in the late 19th and early 20th century. The white population tolerated their Indian neighbors and lived mostly peacefully with them. Settlers in northwest Iowa after the Civil War found an environment very different from the one they knew farther east. Endless rolling prairies dominated the landscape. Trees, other than along waterways, were rare. The climate of western Iowa was also drier and windier. This helps the spread of fires, which discouraged the growth of trees. My first real memory of the prairie is of its vastness. One could see for miles in every direction, including up, wrote Frances Olson Day in a reminiscence written in the early 20th century. Her family lived near Lake City, about 60 miles northwest of Ames. Iowa author Hamlin Garland called the northern Iowa prairie wide, sunny, and windy country. The prairie soil was a rich black loam covered with a thick layer of tangled roots. The sod was tough to plow, but the soil was full of decomposed and nutrient-rich plant material. Up to 90% of a prairie plant's mass was underground. Roots could penetrate more than 6 feet below the ground. In the decades after the Civil War, new waves of immigrants filled in Iowa's empty prairies, and the completion of a railroad network tied the state to the rest of the country. Iowa's railroads encouraged immigration and economic development, even as the railroad transportation monopoly became exploitative. By 1880, the state had more than 1.6 million people, almost 1 million more than 1860. So between 1850 and 1880, Iowa gained nearly 1.5 million people, a mostly forgotten, incredible giant land rush that filled in most of the state. Diverse people, many of them foreign-born, moved to the state. Many came from Central and Southern Europe after the Civil War. Some of your ancestors, Czechs, Italians, African Americans who had fled the South or had come to the South after service in the Civil War. They joined previous waves of Germans, Scandinavians, Dutch, and Irish. Early 20th century, especially the First World War, brought prosperity to Iowa as high farm prices and increased employment boosted the fortunes of its inhabitants. New forms of communication and transportation began to transform Iowa as things like radio, improved roads, automotive, and movies reshaped daily life for Iowans. After the war ended, commodity prices crashed, and the state fell into a prolonged agricultural recession. Iowa had a Great Depression in the 1920s before the Great Depression ever started. Farm prices had collapsed, and the banking system fell apart, and Iowa in the 1920s and 1930s suffered terribly, in a way unlike most other places. By the time the Great Depression hit the state, it had already suffered a very long, painful decade of distress. The Great Depression had many causes. There is, of course, the famous speculative mania of Wall Street, as well as the long agricultural depression that we just mentioned. On the surface, the 1920s had seemed to be a prosperous time, but income growth was limited to the wealthiest, which should bring some echoes today, and millions of families lived near subsistence levels. Late in the decade, the overall economy began to slow. Parts of Europe and Asia fell into recession. In October 1929, the stock market plummeted. It had doubled in value since early 1928. The crash contributed to the economic downturn that was already in the making. Consumer demand fell. Even as business slowed, the stock market had boomed, fed by easy credit and greed. Wall Street's decline presaged an overall economic deterioration. Commodity prices crashed. Corn prices fell almost 80% in 3 years from already low levels. In 1930, the economy contracted by 12.6%, far worse than we saw here during the Great Recession. Unemployment began to climb. By 1932, the United States and the state of Iowa were in the midst of the greatest economic crisis in the country's history. The shaky American financial system added to this brewing disaster. It had always been unstable. Hundreds of banks had failed every year in the 1920s, destroying savings as institutions went under. Over 1,300 banks collapsed in 1930. More than 2,000 failed in 1931. Iowa led the nation in bank failures in the 1920s. An average of 87 banks failed in Iowa from 1921 to 1931. More than one half of the banks in the state had closed or been liquidated by the time FDR was inaugurated. The depressed agricultural economy strained not only family budgets, but also jeopardized the survival of local banks that served small towns and a rural population. A combination of low prices and high debt left Iowans in an extraordinarily precarious economic situation. Now, life had been difficult long before the Great Depression had hit Iowa. 1/3 of the population of the United States survived on less than $100 a month in the 1920s. Iowan Slim Coyer, a bartender from Waterloo, did not live in a house with running water until he was 11. In the late 1930s, Coyer and others who were desperate for work gathered at 4 a.m. in the winter in hopes of being chosen by some farmer for the privilege of working for 15 cents an hour. When he joined the Army in 1941, he was one of 2 recruits in his company of about 200 who had completed 8th grade. John Ortega, whose family had come to Iowa from Mexico in the 1920s looking for work, wrote that his grandmother had died in childbirth in 1927, leaving behind 8 children. Ortega's family lived in a drafty shed in Buffalo Center, where his infant sister Josephine died from pneumonia. Ortega's father did not have the money to buy a casket, so he built one for his daughter. Slim Coyer told historian Studs Terkel that once the Great Depression hit, the dominant thing was helpless despair and submission. There was anger and rebellion among a few, but by and large, that quiet desperation and submission. And as the economy contracted, the prices of almost everything declined. In late 1932, a bushel of corn earned a farmer 10 cents. Property prices tumbled, leaving many with debts that far exceeded the value of their land. The collapsing banking system destroyed savings, eliminated credit for people and businesses, and left the entire country with a cash shortage. In some Iowa counties, lenders owned 30% of the farmland. Arthur Lief lost his home, land, livestock, and almost all of his possessions in 1930. His church also expelled him. To survive, he sold magazine and newspaper subscriptions, tools, groceries, and nursery stock, traveling by car from town to town. His wife, Marie, cared for their children in his absence. He worked on a farm they rented on weekends. 40 years after the Depression, Oscar Heline bitterly remarked about the foreclosure process. First, they'd take your farm, then they took your livestock, then they took your farm machinery, finally they took your household goods, and then they'd move you off. In one township in Johnson County, the average sale price for land fell below $100 an acre in 1936. In the 1930s, the environment seemed to conspire with the Depression to spread misery. The winter of 1935-1936 was one of the coldest in Iowa history. Faye Tomlinson Wookie recalled the temperature in February of 1936 did not rise above zero, and it could fall to 25 degrees below zero at night before wind chill. The town of Red Oak got 43 inches of snow in January and February. Wookie and her family slept next to their stove to survive. A scorching summer followed the brutal winter. In the summer, her family slept outside on cots to try to stay cool. It was often more than 100 degrees during the day. There was no rain, and wells went dry. Strong winds brought red dirt from the Central Plains that covered them where they slept at night. So parts of soil from the Dust Bowl of Kansas and Colorado ended up drifting over into Iowa, and of course drifting across the Atlantic Ocean. Irma J. Long remembered the hellish summer. She said it was heat, heat, heat. We have been literally buried in it. She said the high temperature stifles and burns and saturates everything. The blistering summer, she wrote, killed more than 400 Iowans. One day it was 116 degrees. In November 1932, Boone farmer Elmer Powers lamented many people think they do not have anything to be thankful for. A local banker attempted suicide 2 days after Powers wrote this. As Christmas neared, he said, not many farm folks are talking about Christmas gifts. Desperate unemployed women in Des Moines turned to prostitution to survive, charging from $1 to $3. Families burned corn to stay warm. A barter economy dominated rural parts of the state. People grew potatoes and raised chickens to feed themselves. They shared houses to save expenses. In those last trying months under Hoover, a chaotic situation came frightfully close to anarchy, wrote Joseph Wilkinson. When Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1933, the last time before that date was moved to January 20th, every sector of the American economy seemed to be failing. Roosevelt had promised the American people a New Deal, phrase that he'd used in accepting the Democratic nomination for president. New Deal was a mix of plans to reform some sectors of the economy, such as banking, and also provide work to the millions of unemployed people across the country. While the New Deal failed to end the Great Depression, it did vast amounts to reduce the misery of Americans in the 1930s. It had also helped build the infrastructure that supported American prosperity in the 1940s and afterwards. It also saved much of the financial system and farming in the United States and the Midwest. Government spending more than doubled in the 1930s. But of course, the New Deal did not bring socialism to the United States, as its worst critics might have said. New Deal helped Americans, and it helped Iowans. It provided crucial relief to millions of people and helped save capitalism from its own failures. That's a generally accepted historical consensus. It helped save capitalism from its own worst instincts. In early March 1933, the new president called Congress into emergency session. Addressing the collapse of the American banking system was the most important task. The collapsing banking system, which had done so much damage to Iowa. Roosevelt officially announced a nationwide banking holiday 2 days after taking office. On March 9th, the Emergency Banking Act became law. It gave the federal government sweeping new powers to reorganize any bank and provide funding to improve its balance sheets. March 14th, Roosevelt explained what the government was doing to assist the financial sector in his first fireside chat. I think you can find that first fireside chat in many places online and possibly also YouTube. Roosevelt reassured Americans that any bank that opened for business the next day would be solvent. Americans believed him. Deposits flooded back into the financial system, and the financial crisis passed. Reforms later that year provided government insurance for deposits, administered by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, with costs shared by the government and banks. So when you walk into your local bank, there's a little sticker in the front that says FDIC. That is from the program from the New Deal. Did not exist until 1933, which is why if your bank went under in Iowa in the 1920s or before 1933, and you didn't get your money out, you lost everything. Henry A. Wallace, editor of the Iowa newspaper Wallace's Farmer, became Secretary of Agriculture in 1933. I think 5 Iowans served as Secretary of Agriculture, including the one most recently under Obama that was our former governor. Henry Wallace's father, Henry C. Wallace, had been Agriculture Secretary in the 1920s, and both men had been longtime advocates for struggling farmers. The younger Wallace was a progressive Republican from Iowa. The ongoing crisis of American agriculture had helped convince him that the government needed to help farmers reduce surpluses and raise prices. Seems to be a common theme through American agricultural history. As Agricultural Secretary, Henry A. Wallace helped usher in a revolution in policy that changed the relationship between farmers and their government. One of the first tasks of Wallace and a new administration was to find a way to help American farmers. The greatest problem was low prices. One of the first pieces of New Deal legislation was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. In part, it tried to increase farm prices by reducing livestock numbers and the amount of acreage planted. The government paid farmers to slaughter millions of pigs to avoid a future pork surplus. Iowan Slim Coyer, who we've seen before in this talk, recalled, "We went out and we bought the pigs and killed them." That is how desperate it was. It was the only way to raise the price of pigs. 100 million pounds of pork and lard from the slaughter was given to family in need. These measures helped increase the price of many crops. Iowa corn farmers did not need to destroy any part of their crop since Mother Nature had assisted with a drought. The government paid corn farmers 30 cents a bushel based on average yields in earlier years. 30 cents, 3 times the very, very low price at the bottom of the Great Depression. Oscar Heline, a lifelong farmer, remembered how farm families felt as their lives slowly improved. It was Wallace who saved us. It was Wallace who put us back on our feet. He understood our problems. Farm income in Iowa more than doubled by 1935, when more than 85% of Iowa land was enrolled in AAA programs. While the financial system began to recover and farm prices started to rise in 1933, millions still suffered from hunger and unemployment. A variety of New Deal programs attempted to reduce unemployment. Not widely known, but the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, had more than 50 camps here in Iowa. A variety of programs, including the CCC, tried to reduce the numbers of the unemployed. The CCC provided government jobs to about 500,000 young men nationwide in its first 2 years. The CCC operated more than 50 camps across Iowa, starting in 1933. They hired men between the ages of 18 and 25 to complete conservation work overseen by the Army. This ranged from planting trees to building campgrounds, roads, trails, cabins, and bridges. In Iowa, the CCC built state parks. It built wildlife refuges. It built wildlife preserves. Nearly 13,000 men were employed at 34 Iowa camps by the end of 1933. And more than 30,000 Iowans had worked for the program by the time it ended about a decade later. Because of regular meals and physical labor, workers gained, on average, 10 pounds during their time in the CCC. They received $30 a month, with $22 to $25 automatically sent home to their families. The money that Wilbur Putnam sent to his family in Dubuque helped his parents pay back taxes on their home and save their family home. CCC camps were located across the state, and they employed white, Latino, and Native American men. Each location had about 200 enrollees. Camps began with tents, but were upgraded to wooden barracks. They also had dining and recreation halls, which might have had a pool table, checkers, and card games. One of the first camps operated not too far from here, south of Boone at Ledges State Park. Men planted 350,000 trees and completed projects to combat erosion. Crews from the camps near Lenox, they built structures, 700 structures by 1935, including dams and diversion ditches. The CCC's Indian Division employed more than 100 Meskwaki. A camp in Tama enrolled about 20 men from the tribe, where they built a community and cultural center, as well as other infrastructure. Government employment provided much-needed income to the tribe, as the Depression had eliminated most job opportunities. There was so much demand for work that it was rotated among the men of the tribe, so as many as possible could share in the income. Other New Deal programs, such as the Works Progress Administration, also provided employment to Iowans and helped produce much of the art that you see here today. The WPA completed work in every Iowa county, building baseball parks, schools, and other infrastructure. The WPA was launched in 1935 and employed millions across the country, mostly men in construction. It also provided jobs for skilled workers, women, African Americans, and the young. John Ortega, whose story we heard about earlier, his father worked for the WPA for $16 a week and helped feed his family during winters when field work was not available. John Ortega, who's a character in a few chapters of the book I'm working on, had started work in the fields at age of 4. And the only reason his family often were able to feed themselves during the Great Depression in Des Moines is because they went out and scavenged through the Des Moines dump along with other families. They found fuel and they found food, and programs like the WPA helped them, as well as thousands, tens of thousands of other Iowans survive the most difficult economic circumstances. The WPA helped with the flood control in Sioux City. It assisted in digging a new channel for the Floyd River. In Dubuque, the WPA built the airport, swimming pools. It constructed a golf course here in Ames, which is about a mile north of us. The program also raised city halls in towns like Mount Pleasant. The WPA constructed libraries, cataloged their contents, and surveyed historical records. It built schools and also provided other educational services, ranging from adult education to after-school programs. Eventually, the WPA employed more than 1 million people in 1936 and 1937. In 1938, the WPA hired more than 41,000 people in Iowa, including more than 4,000 women. Only one person per household could work for the WPA, and men received preference. The women often completed sewing, so clothing could be given to those in need. But women also labored in clerical, education, and library work. Domestic aides helped with the sick and the disabled. Library workers set up the first WPA bookmobile in Lucas County. Cooks and servers helped provide almost 4 million hot lunches to students in Iowa during the Depression, a program that continued in many schools after the WPA ended in the middle of the Second World War. 68 Iowa counties had nursery schools sponsored by the program. And most important in terms of our story here, the WPA was an innovative and sometimes controversial program that supported extraordinary creative efforts in arts, the theater, and music. Detractors argued that the program wasted money on art programs and produced material critical of American society. Yet WPA projects also created lasting treasures in Iowa and across the country, many of which you see here in this collection and across Iowa, especially in murals in courthouses and in post offices, including, I think, the one here in Ames. 40,000 unemployed writers across the United States worked for the Federal Writers Project, producing regional and state guidebooks, as well as collecting the stories of former slaves. On a side note, the WPA collected narratives of former slaves is totally digitized by the Library of Congress. All 20-something volumes can be found if you simply Google WPA slave narratives Library of Congress. Of course, you can send me an email and I can give you any information that we mention here. Federal Writers Project also wrote regional and state guidebooks, including the one on Iowa, which is recently republished by the University of Iowa. A few years ago, on my copy, I found the Half Price Books. Half Price Books, by the way, has a great Iowa section down in Clive. If you're curious, all sorts of useful material. More than 100 WPA workers helped write the Iowa State Guide. Actors and playwrights working for the WPA's Federal Theater Project performed plays across the country, while musicians gave concerts or taught students to play instruments. The Iowa Federal Theater Project presented more than 20 plays in Des Moines in the spring of 1937. In 1935 and 1936, the WPA's Federal Music Project sponsored more than 100 concerts in Des Moines at parks, schools, and other public places. Iowa artists on the WPA payroll produced more than 100 original paintings that were given to schools and libraries, as well as many murals in public buildings still visible today. Iowa artist Grant Wood now famous for American Gothic, completed work for the New Deal during the 1930s. Would have been born near Anamosa in 1891. A quiet and shy boy, his artistic talents developed in high school. He took drawing classes at the University of Iowa while working as a teacher at a one-room schoolhouse. In the 1920s, he visited Europe several times, traveling to Italy. After his return to Cedar Falls in 1924, he set up a studio and a home in a large spare room in a building owned by a friend. He was extraordinarily productive over the next 11 years at this location, and most of his best-known work was produced during this time. In 1930, American Gothic won him immediate fame. He was briefly employed as director of Iowa's Public Works of Art project in 1934. The artists that Wood hired, including Christian Peterson, painted murals at Iowa State University depicting Iowa's cultural history, from farming to engineering. Later that year, he was appointed Associate Professor of Fine Arts at the University of Iowa, spending the rest of his relatively short career in life at the school, struggling to be accepted because of his lack of a college degree, his homosexuality, and also a style that was quite different than that which was appreciated at the time. He died in 1942 at the age of 50, and his reputation's only grown in the decades after his death. So that paragraph right there is going in my chapter on the Great Depression, so I can assure you art is not left out of my story of Iowa. Everything I'm talking about here goes in this book, so the tough details on the history of Iowa, as well as some of the more positive ramifications of the New Deal. The New Deal poured more than $1 billion in 1930s money, which might be 15 or 20 billion dollars in today's money, was poured into Iowa during the Depression. The state received more money per capita than any other state in the Midwest, except for North and South Dakota, who had much smaller populations. New Deal programs employed tens of thousands of people in the state. They helped the farm economy recover, and they began to bring electricity to Iowa's rural majority through the Rural Electrification Program, which built power lines and took electricity to areas outside of cities and towns. The New Deal did not end the Depression. It took enormous government spending during World War II to do that. But it brought lots of relief and some recovery to Iowans during, you could say, 20 years of depression in the 1920s and 1930s. The New Deal money flowed in the 30s. The financial system in the state stabilized, and money from the government flowed into Iowa beginning in 1933. Despite the recovery from the depths of the Depression, by the end of the decade, corporations, banks, and insurance companies still owned about 20% of all Iowa farmland in 1940. But 30,000 farms in the state received electrical power in 1936, by 1936. And tens of thousands or more in Iowa and across the country would be electrified throughout the 1940s. Now, anyone that knows about the Depression knows that it left scars on people. I have a grandmother who is 93, going to see her next month. And whenever we go out to eat with her, if there's anything left over, she takes a napkin and folds it up and puts it in her purse. We always remind her that you don't have to do that. You're never going to go hungry as long as we're with you. But she always does it because she grew up in the Depression. Many of you may have had family members who understand that. Some of you are shaking your head. Great Depression left permanent scars on the psyche of millions of Americans. James Hearst, well-known Iowa writer, recalled how the crisis affected his family. Quote, "We just dug in and faced what had to be faced and survived. But no one who weathered the Depression ever escaped without a kind of obsession for security. Arthur Lief, the traveling salesman we saw earlier, he eventually found success. Art and his wife Marie lived frugally. They always feared hard times. They never bought a new car, but they did find a new church who opened them with welcome arms. Marie taught in a rural school, and they sent their kids to college. They bought a farm in Hamilton County and paid it off long, long before they passed away. Iowans suffered terribly during the Depression, which followed almost a decade of economic misery in the state. Iowa had been hit hard by the economic calamity. The banking system in the state collapsed, as did farm prices. Franklin Roosevelt's election brought the New Deal, stabilized the financial and agricultural sectors, employed tens of thousands of Iowans, helped bring electricity to many parts of the state. While the New Deal was an incomplete success, it had a profound impact on the lives of many Iowans and inspired, as you see here, some fantastic art. So, thank you. I finished early. Forgive me if I talked a little too fast. But if you have questions, I assume I have a few minutes for them. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned it in passing towards the end of your talk about $1 billion in the 1930s being worth about $15 billion today. Mm-hmm. I think you would find it interesting to download the inflation calculator from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and look at all the monetary units that you mentioned in your entire speech and adjust them to current dollars. Okay. You start out in 1913, for instance, with a factor of 22. Mm-hmm. This decreases during World War II, but in the Depression it goes back to about a factor of 20. So the inflation calculator changes a lot through the years. It goes up, mostly up, but sometimes down. Mm-hmm. And $100 in the 1930s would be at least 1,000 today. 10-cent corn would be like $2, $2 corn today. It's bad, but not as bad as it sounds if you give all the units in the terms that were used then. Money is not the absolute indicator of value. Value resides in what money can buy for human beings in goods and services. And I think a lot of people get this wrong. The things were bad, but they were not as bad as they sound. If you talk about 10 cents corn.
Iowa farm income from like 1920 to the mid-30s fell by 97%. So the prices were, if you look at inflation, are not as terrible as it sounds, but the situation was extraordinarily dire. Yes. And it's in...
Well, my grandparents and parents were family farmers in northwest Iowa during the 20s and 30s. And you're quite right, it left a very profound impression on them, much of which they passed on to their children.
Yeah, I grew up in California in the 70s and 80s, and when electricity prices got high, I would get chewed up by my parents if I didn't turn the light off immediately upon leaving the room. And the 70s were by no way anything close to the 30s at all. Excellent point. A question behind this man, forgive me and then I'll work over it. Yeah.
I just want to congratulate you on such a summary overview that was packed with information and it's really compelling. But I have one question which goes back to the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit more about the forced land sales that the Sac and Meskwaki were required to do? Because so many other tribes were literally just forced off their land, and yes, they got treaties and allotments and so forth, but they didn't sell their land.
For example, if you want to think about the most famous part of American Indian removal, think of the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes in the American South. They were forced to sell their land. They were giving some money. The cost of removal and other things were deducted from that. With the Sac and Meskwaki, they were giving some amount of money or allotments in return for their land and then forced west. Often the tribe had debts, and so the payments often were canceled out by any debts. I see someone raising a hand here who might know more than me. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was pretty much the case, especially for the Treaty of 1842. A lot of that went to cancel out trade debts from some fairly unscrupulous traders working both for American Fur and the Ewing brothers.
Yeah. So, and a lot of what literally received immediately disappeared into the hands of white people who had, through high prices and hook or by crook, had got their customers in debt. Yeah.
What's your projected date for your book?
Good question. The great thing about this project is there is an immense amount of resources. The terrible thing about this project is there is an immense amount of resources. I currently have 5 or 6 chapters mostly done and a few others in draft. To write some of this, I had to, Oh, by the way, if you want a copy, shoot me an email of this and I can give it to you. Good Lord, probably 2 to 3 years. Duties here on campus, especially with teacher education, tend to eat my semester, and I teach Iowa history over the summer. I'm hoping late 2021. If anyone here wants to read any draft chapters, please send me an email. But that's the hope. The state has new teacher education standards. The textbook that they use in elementary, as well as Dorothy Schreeder's very good book, are both a bit outdated and lack lots of information. For example, the current, I guess you could say, college textbook, as well as elementary school textbook, has very little on the African American regiment from Iowa that fought during the Civil War. Don't have as much on civil rights as well. The Latino history is left out. And a lot of the stories I'm finding in the Iowa Women's Archive and the University of Iowa need to be incorporated here. For example, the paragraph where I talked about how bad the weather was in 1935 and 1936, that comes from 2 sources written by women I found over in the University of Iowa in Iowa City at the State Archive. I have lots to do, but hopefully a couple years. So if you happen to be an editor of a university press, I am looking, shoot me an email, I'm looking for a publisher. Other questions over here? Yeah, we'll go in front. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to build off of questions about Iowa at the moment of Indian removal, about 1830. We had seen some unscrupulous traders. Can you describe more of what Iowa's trade economy looked like around 1830?
1830.
People involved, what was being traded, what was being interacted with?
Well, 1830, Iowa doesn't have that many people. Those that might be living in central Iowa were probably few and far between. There would have been some soldiers, there would have been some forts, there would have been some traders who were selling alcohol and weapons and maybe tools and something like that for high prices. And if you're selling ammunition or you're selling weapons, you can get a very good price for a tribe that might need those for hunting or for self-defense. So it is those that are unregulated by the federal government who can be out on a frontier where there's not much American law. In fact, many American Army officers, as well as government officers, said that these whiskey traders or these salesmen were kind of the scum of the earth who were out to exploit those who, in many ways, could not defend themselves. In fact, God, I don't have everything with me, and I haven't worked on this chapter in about a year, but there were some of those that lived in central Iowa who had said that even those that moved to the frontier looking for land, pushing into native land, they had called, I think, frontier scum. They're out for their own advantage. They're out to take what they can get. Laws or treaties be damned. So it is in many ways, if you think of the Wild West, you can think of the moving American frontier often as a lawless place where it's easy to exploit those without numbers or guns. I've got part of a chapter on territorial Iowa written. Give me 6 months, shoot me an email, and I'll get you a better answer. Good question. There was other questions. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the period of time before the Great Depression, how Iowa, there was a depression before there was a depression. Did you find anything about child labor in Iowa? It's personal for me. My grandfather was sent to work on a farm in northwest Iowa, and he talked about ads being put in the Des Moines Register, basically, or whatever the paper was at the time, to basically say, here's an able-bodied boy.
That would have happened. The horrible exploitation of people who were immigrants or those who might have been underage children occurred all over this country. And if you think that sex labor and sex work still occurs by thousands in this country, but in places in Iowa cities, Des Moines, maybe some of the cities on the river, Sioux City or Dubuque, they would have had, factories. They would have had sawmills. They would have had factories producing kilns, producing pottery, or they would have had factories in Des Moines. And read a couple of accounts of a report on child labor, I think in the 1910s or 1920s, that painted just a scathing review of, I think, was it 30,000, 20,000 Iowa children under the age of 18 were exploited in factories. Once again, let me finish that chapter. Maybe 6 months, I can provide more information to you. But yeah, that would have been widespread in Iowa, the exploitation of everyone. Even the famous orphan trains, if you think of that in popular culture, orphan trains doing great things for kids who had nobody. I have a story of a young man who was sent to Iowa from New York. Both his parents had been killed in a trolley accident. And he basically was inspected like livestock on one of these orphan trains. And then he was sent to work for a family, and it was so horrible he escaped and ran away, and then joined the army because that was an easier, less painful life. They had forced him to work till his hands bled, fed him very little. So in many ways, this is a very tough world for children and those who labor very hard. That's not the most eloquent thing I've ever said, but it is there. This world is in many ways very removed from us. It is a world in some ways we're glad we left behind, where their government regulation was highly limited and exploitation was widespread. Other questions, please? Yeah, go ahead.
Mine is really simple. So you said in the 1930s, Iowa received the most per capita from the New Deal than in the Midwest, at least compared to North Dakota, South Dakota. Was that because Henry Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture, or was it because we were that bad off?
It's because we were that bad off. I don't know the percentage of other states enrolled in the AAA, but Iowa suffered from one of the most horrible economies in the country. You don't normally think of maybe Iowa as having suffered as badly as a place like California. You think John Steinbeck or maybe New York. But the banking sector had collapsed. I think Iowans had lost $200 million from the collapsing banking system. Agricultural prices were very low for 20 years. And about 25% to 30% of the state was owned by non-farmers, had been lost. So Iowa suffered horribly in many ways that we forget today. We may think of the farm crisis, but there was a much longer, drawn-out farm crisis that was as bad as or worse than the 1980s. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. Jeff, the Farm Security Administration in the 30s had a famous photography division, and some of the most iconic photos from the Depression come from that activity, like Dorothea Lange
Yes.
and Walker Evans. Was there any of that photography activity occurring in Iowa?
I've not come across it yet, but then I've not fully explored all thousands of I'm glad to be corrected.
Arthur Rothstein in particular came through Iowa, did all kinds of pictures in Iowa City, but also across the state. I'm not sure when this happened.
Oh, fantastic. Glad to be wrong. Always glad to be wrong because I can. There's your answer. Other questions? Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, in the exhibition, you talk about the conservation camps, and there is a great painting that Leah chose from the University of Iowa, the museum there, in the far back corner where it's a CCC camp, and they're it's all planting trees.
Yeah.
And it's actually a very kind of interesting painting, too, when you go look at it. And it's in that far back corner, and it just depicts exactly what you described.
It's the two characters in it are very long and elongated, and there's goalies behind them, and they're planting a couple trees, and it's obviously something from the CCC. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too because we have in our collection other WPA prints that were circulated, including the Thomas event in Keys from Kansas City, but plowing under, so they're references to things that are happening in the art. And you can see that in this exhibition and other museums.
Other questions? Hopefully I can give you a decent answer to. Oh, yes.
Well, two things. I just want to thank you for saying that the New Deal was good, because past 4 years we've been told it's been bad. You know. And the second part is, anytime there was a depression, the tribe has always gone on the land buying. We've always bought land during the depression.
Yeah.
Because that's when the lands are cheap.
Yeah, I have left a couple of sentences out here in which Eric Zimmer, who did a study of the Meskwaki, had talked about how the tribe had bought land whenever it could. Yeah, excellent point.
And sometimes that land, we allow the farmers and their family to stay on their land. And we would split profits if they had a profit-making year, and we put that toward taxes. So many of the pieces of land that we bought, we didn't evict the farmers who would have been evicted, and we developed strong relationships with them. And we had one piece that we bought in the late 1800s, and they moved off of it in 1980. So the family stayed there almost 100 years.
Okay.
So.
I need to sit down and talk with the two of you. I've not written the pre-territorial chapter yet, but I will exploit your knowledge. I will need to get your contact information. Other questions? Yeah, in back.
Do you know if there were any demonstration farms that employed civilian conservation corps employees in Iowa that were showcasing soil conservation measures and things like that?
That is a good question. Email me that, and I'll look it up when I head back to the Iowa City State Historical Society. Anybody know that? Demonstration Farms, Soil Conservation Service? Yeah, go ahead.
There were some up near the Iowa Great Lakes that did drainage work.
Okay.
Doing conservation practices.
Excellent. As I always tell my students, they will know combined a hell of a lot more than I do, and you guys have demonstrated that yet again. So I need to, there are many things I've not done yet. This is a huge project, but you've given me ideas. Other questions I can attempt, even partially, to answer. Yes?
I came in late, but did the Iowa State Forestry College have any part in this new deal at all, or did they just have predated, or in fact any agriculture aspect of this university did it?
I've not explored that. Does anyone know that about? Can you maybe repeat that question a little louder?
I just wondered if the Forestry College or any ag college in this university had any impact on the New Deal at impression on it?
I'm sure they were involved in some way. That's
Probably the experiment station.
probably. I can't tell you. There's, once again, you guys are continually plumbing the depths of what I don't know, which means it's a good question.
I think the money lines were very different, but certainly there was interaction back and forth between them.
Okay.
The land grant universities get a different stream of money, so. And the forestry groups especially was the same thing, so. But I'll look too, I'm curious.
Okay. Other questions? Or maybe I'm out of time. Maybe be shuffled off.